For 5 years, it looked like the Weimar Republic might actually work. Inflation was tamed, the violence had faded, and here in Berlin, the city had become something incredible. It had become a magnet for artists, radicals, misfits, and dreamers. Nightclubs spilled into the streets. Women had the right to vote. Same sex bars operated out in the open. It was chaotic and fragile, but it felt free. This part of the story, the high before the fall, is often overshadowed by what comes later. But it is very important to understand why the crash was so devastating here in Berlin. Because just for a moment, Berliners felt like they had a future, and then it all slipped through their fingers. Before we dive into the crash, a quick word about what came before. The Weimar Republic was born out of defeat and revolution in 1918. It was fragile, bitterly divided, and for most of the 1920s, hanging by a thread. Germany faced political extremism, inflation, foreign occupation, and attempted coups, and somehow, through it all, Berlin still functioned. Somehow, it even flourished. This video will touch on a few of those tensions, but it's not the full story. A deeper series on the rise and fall of Weimar is coming. For now, just keep in mind, the Republic had already survived one near-death experience. It wouldn't survive the next. The Berlin of the late 1920s felt like a city that had survived something terrible, and was determined to live louder because of it. The streets were alive with music, film, fashion, art movements collided. Cabaret shows played to packed houses. There was an openness, even recklessness in the air, as if Berlin had decided it had nothing left to lose. From 1924 to 1929, Berlin had rebounded. People were working again. New apartments were being built. Modern trams crisscrossed the city. Department stores sparkled with imported goods. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for millions of Berliners, it was the first time in years that life felt ordinary in the best sense of the word, and extraordinary in others. Berlin's nightlife was notorious, and proud of it. The city boasted some of the most daring performance spaces in Europe. Jazz from America, satire from Germany, nudity, drag, comedy, politics, often all on the same stage. It was provocative, political, and deeply human. This freedom, especially in sexual identity and gender expression, was shocking to conservative eyes. But in Berlin, it was something close to normal. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, openly advocating for gay rights and transgender visibility, stood as a symbol of the era's radical openness. Artists too found sanctuary. George Gross, Otto Dix, Lotte Laserstein, painting a raw, honest Berlin in all of its contradictions. UFA Studios was exporting films across Europe. Fritz Lang's Metropolis had captured imaginations worldwide. But it wasn't just spectacle. Ordinary Berliners were living lives they could shape again. Even if money was tight, people felt like they had a future. That feeling, the sense that tomorrow might actually be better, was intoxicating, and it was visible in the way people walked, the way they talked, and the way they dressed. A new middle class was emerging. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Children went to school in buildings designed with natural light. The air in certain neighborhoods smelled of coal smoke, coffee, and hope. You could still find the scars, of course. Veterans begging with missing limbs. Tenements still overcrowded. Old men still cursing the Republic under their breath. But on the whole, Berlin had pulled itself out of the abyss. It felt alive, which is exactly why the crash, when it came, was so brutal. There were no warning sirens, no shuttered windows, no announcement, just rumors. In October 1929, news filtered in from across the Atlantic. The American stock market had collapsed. Bankers were jumping from buildings. Fortunes had vanished. The initial response in Berlin was a mix of disbelief and detachment. It wasn't our crisis. It wasn't our fault, but Berlin was more connected to the global economy than many realized. Within weeks, credit began to tighten. Loans weren't renewed. Factories delayed new hires. New building projects froze. Executives began to whisper, to hold back, to prepare for something, but few yet understood what that something was. That would come soon enough. By the start of 1930, there were layoffs, then more, then a wave of them. People who had jobs in the winter were out of work by spring. Construction ground to a halt. The cafes and cabarets that had once filled every night began to go dark. Berlin's sense of momentum, of movement, was gone, and in its place came silence. The crash didn't just rob Berlin of its economy, it robbed the city of its mood. Suddenly, a place that had pulsed with energy was cautious, tight, and grim. That optimism, that sense that Berlin was building something new, drained away. It was as if the lights were still on, but nobody was dancing. And yet, for many Berliners, the full weight of the crisis hadn't arrived. Not yet, but they could feel it in their bones, in their buildings, in the way strangers stopped making eye contact on the tram. The crash was coming, and it would hit Berlin harder than anyone expected.
Berlin was the beating heart of the Weimar Republic. It was fast, it was bold, it was chaotic. But when the crash came, it hit Berlin harder than anywhere else in Germany. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a collapse of daily life. Entire neighborhoods, working class strongholds like here in Wedding or Neukölln or Kreuzberg were devastated. Factories like here at AEG fell silent. Paychecks stopped, and soup kitchens opened where cafes were just months before. In this part, we walk into the aftermath, the Berlin of the 1930s, and see what happens when a city built on movement suddenly grinds to a halt.
In early 1930, Berlin began to come apart, not with a bang, but with a slow and steady unraveling. Within a year of the Wall Street crash, millions were out of work in Germany, and hundreds of thousands were in Berlin. Some had lost jobs in the factories. Others had lost them in offices. Shops, theaters, cafes, all cut staff or closed completely. The change wasn't immediate, but it was relentless. Osram in Wedding, Siemens in Charlottenburg, the printing presses in Kreuzberg. One by one, they slowed, then stopped, then let workers go by the thousands. Apartments once shared by families now had whole floors packed tight. Beds were rented by the hour. Pawn shops ran out of goods. Churches opened soup kitchens, and political parties followed suit, trying to show that they could feed where the state had failed. Children dropped out of school. Teachers reported fainting, hunger, even malnourishment. In some schools, winter coats were shared among students, passed from one child to another at the door. The word most often used to describe the men standing around Berlin's parks and train stations was Wartender, the waiters, not in restaurants, in life. These were the unemployed, too proud or too hopeless to beg, too ashamed to go home during the day. They just stood. For those still working, wages shrank, hours stretched, and the fear of being next was constant. Berlin's atmosphere shifted. The vibrant city of lights and laughter became a city of glances and silences. Cafes grew quieter. Newspapers sold fewer copies. Theaters went dark. Even the nightlife, Berlin's pride, dulled under the weight of worry. But people adapted. Neighbors shared coal. Women created barter networks. Children were taught to walk slowly indoors to conserve shoes. People adjusted. They always do. And yet, beneath that surface, something was changing. Because poverty didn't just bring hunger, it brought blame. People began to wonder, who let this happen? Who benefited from this? Why are they okay when we are suffering? Political flyers started showing up again. The Communist Party blamed the capitalists, the far right blamed the communists, the center tried to hold the line, but fewer people were listening. The Weimar government, trapped by international debt and internal division, had little room to act. And the people, in Berlin especially, began to turn away. The sense of shared future that had animated Berlin during its golden years was gone. In its place, survival. Just beneath survival, anger. The crash didn't just take money from Berliners. It took their momentum. It stole their sense of possibility. And in that vacuum, something else began to grow.
By the early 1930s, Berlin wasn't just a city in crisis. It was a city at war with itself. The crash hadn't only created poverty, it created power vacuums in government, in neighborhoods, in the minds of ordinary citizens. And into those power vacuums stepped the radicals. Street politics wasn't just a metaphor. In places like Wedding, Friedrichshain, and here in Kreuzberg, control of the street, of the corner, of the block, of the building meant power and that power was contested every single day. In this part, we walk into the storm, the pitched street battles, the barricades, the violence that turned Berlin from a broken capital into a battlefield.
By 1931, Berlin's political culture had moved out of the parliament and onto the pavement. The Reichstag still met, but power had shifted, not officially, not legally, but practically, to the streets. In the working class districts of Wedding and Friedrichshain, the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, had deep roots. These weren't just political affiliations. They were neighborhood identities. Union halls, libraries, youth groups, sports clubs, all aligned under the red banner. The Rote Front Kampfverbund, the KPD's paramilitary arm, patrolled the streets, guarded meetings, and clashed with their enemies, including the police. To the communists, the police were not neutral. They were the armed wing of a failing state. Raids were common, and when weapons or banned literature were found, arrests followed. When nothing was found, arrests often followed anyway. And on the other side came the stormtroopers. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, exploded in size after the crash. Many of its recruits were working class, angry, unemployed, humiliated by defeat, drawn to violence. They wore uniforms, marched in tight formations, sang battle songs from the old empire, and they brought their fights directly to Berlin. Neighborhoods like Neukölln, Kreuzberg, and Moabit saw near constant conflict. Flyers were torn down, walls were painted and repainted, meetings were disrupted, windows smashed, and clubs ransacked. The police tried to keep order, sometimes, but often they just stood aside, or stood with one side. In Wedding, communist protests were met with truncheons and gunfire. In Kreuzberg, SA marches were allowed to pass through hostile areas, practically guaranteeing violence. Barricades returned to Berlin. Not symbolic ones, real ones. Furniture, cobblestones, iron bars. Whole intersections turned into war zones. Some blocks were so politicized that they were nicknamed like military fronts. Red Wedding wasn't just a phrase, it was a warning. And yet this was still daily life. Children played in alleys as protesters chanted nearby. Couples walked past police lines on their way to dinner. The strange thing was not how extreme it became, but how normal it all started to feel. Violence wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Because by this point, most Berliners had stopped believing the state could protect them. So they turned to the parties, or the factions that promised to. For the left, it was the dream of workers' control. For the right, it was a return to national pride. For the center, it was silence, or confusion, or absence. The streets of Berlin became the real parliament, and politics was settled with fists. The communists and the Nazis weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting for the same thing, the hearts of the poor, the disillusioned, the jobless. Each claimed to represent the real Germany. Each claimed the other was the true threat, but one of them had more support from within the institutions, from businessmen, bureaucrats, and even elements of the police. And the communists? They had numbers, but not power. Berlin was still officially a democracy, but democracy doesn't just die in elections. Sometimes it dies in stairwells, on sidewalks, and in silence. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's murdered.
By the summer of 1930, Berlin felt like a city that was holding its breath. The Depression had cut deep, but something more dangerous was happening. Not just to the economy, but to the system itself. People weren't just losing jobs, they were losing patience, they were losing faith, and increasingly, they were choosing sides. This wasn't the end of democracy in Germany. Not yet, but it was the moment when something cracked, where the rules began to dissolve, and something darker emerged from these cracks.
The crash didn't just devastate Berlin's economy, it ruptured what remained of its fragile political center. Before the Depression, the Weimar Republic had survived by balancing opposites, liberals and socialists, Catholics and nationalists, old elites, and a new generation of voters. But after 1929, that balance began to collapse. The Social Democrats, still the largest party, held on to power but were paralyzed, unwilling to pursue bold reforms, unable to stop the bleeding. Their coalition partners were fractured, and the conservative parties, once reliable allies, had begun to drift toward the extreme right. Anti-Semitism became a mainstay in most of the conservative parties. President Hindenburg, who was aging, aristocratic, and a skeptic of parliament, grew tired of compromise. When Chancellor Helmut Muller's coalition fell apart in March 1930 over unemployment insurance, Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning to lead the government, but Brüning didn't have a majority in the Reichstag. Instead, he ruled almost entirely by emergency decree, invoking Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to bypass parliament altogether. It wasn't dictatorship yet, but it wasn't democracy either. The Reichstag still met, but increasingly it was theater, not governance. Elections were coming, but nobody knew if they mattered anymore. Back in 1928, Germany had still voted from the center. The Social Democrats won 29%. The Communists held steady. The Nazis were barely a footnote, getting just 2.6% of the vote. Most people still believed that moderation could hold. But 1930 was different. Now the Nazis weren't just fringe radicals. They were gaining ground, and they were gaining ground fast. Their message had sharpened. Destroy the system. Blame the elites. Blame the Jews. Reject the Treaty of Versailles. And end unemployment. They targeted the young, the disillusioned, and the fearful. And they weren't alone. The communists too had hardened. No longer allies of the center-left. They saw the Social Democrats as social fascists, traitors to the working class. The crash had come to Berlin, and what it left behind wasn't just poverty. It was a vacuum that was waiting to be filled. In the next episode, we turn to that election, the campaigns, the clashes, and the numbers that shocked the world. In September 1930, Berliners voted, hungry, angry, and ready for change. And what they chose would change everything.